Hi, I'm Sandra Hawkins and I want to show you variables in Java. So a variable is a storage space in your program that you can store values in and maybe use them to manipulate or multiply them or perform some operation on, or maybe to use them later on in your program. So first thing you need to do, open up Eclipse and in there, File, New, Java Project. I'm going to call this variables. And just checking everything here because we're only starting out. Use default location, yes, where everything goes there in C users folder. Using JDK 14, yes. Project layout, I'm just clicking next here because I don't want to create a module info.java file because it just complicates matters at the minute. And click on finish. So that will create a project, so it's simply a folder for adding in your Java code. And now in there, I want to right click on that source folder and I want to put in a new class. Now I'm going to call that variables as well. And in here, I want to put in a main method. So again, the main method is when you run the program, the Java virtual machine will know where your program starts from. So we're only starting out and doing basics, so everything will be typed into main for this example as well. And click on finish. Now I'm just pasting in a comment that I've written earlier, just a bit about variables. So variables in Java, so it's storage for values in your program, or it's memory for values to keep your values in, and then you'll use them later on in the program. So for example, you might read in a person's username and password from a graphical user interface. You'd store them in a variable, then you go to the database and maybe check the value in your variables against the values in the database to see if they match or not. So that's just one example. So we're going to look at the 8 primitive types, so the basic types in Java, and as well just look at a string. Now there are 8 primitive types, but I'm just going to read down through them and point out the most important ones that you would need to use. So firstly is a Boolean, so that's 1 byte in memory, and it stores the value either true or false. So char, or character, a char, it takes up 2 bytes in memory and it stores just 1 single character. And then the integer or whole number types, there are 4 of those: a byte, a short, an int, and a long. So a byte takes up the least amount of memory, 1 byte, but it can only store a value range from -128 to a +127. So that mightn't be used a great deal. It uses up less memory than the others, but if memory is an issue and you have a very small number to store, a byte would be good. The short is twice the amount of storage, and it stores a range from -32,768 to a +32767. So the most common data type that would be used for whole numbers here would be an int, because it's large enough to store pretty much any number that you want, and you don't need to worry about overloading or putting too much high of a value in the likes of a short or a byte. And then a long is 8 bytes, but that's really a very large number. You can see the range there. So usually an int is for a whole number. And then the other alternative, if you don't have a whole number, maybe you've got a number with a decimal point in it, which are also known as floating point numbers. So there are 2 there, a float and a double. So a double would be the one that would mainly be used. In my example underneath, I'll just explain why the double would be used more. So now, just to put in some examples down here. So to declare a variable, now just popping in a comment here that I have from earlier. I'll just tidy it up a little bit. So to declare a variable, you need to specify the data type, a name for that variable that you want to refer to it, and then optionally you can assign it a value on the same line. So little comment there. So the data type, for example, Boolean, what name you want to give it. So I'm going to put is summer. So Booleans usually start with is. It's just a naming convention, like is summer, is logged in, is valid, that kind of thing. You can optionally then give it a value on the same line. So equals, I'm going to put in false, and a semicolon. So that's a statement and it must end in a semicolon. So if I want to say print out that value, I'm going to do a system.out.println, and the shortcut for that is sout and control space. And I'm going to put in here just a string first of all. Is it summer? and a question mark. And at the end of that string, I'm going to concatenate, which is plus, the value from that variable. So the variable there is called isSummer. Now I've typed in is S, I'm going to put control space. So control space is that autocomplete. So I can see there that isSummer is highlighted and I can hit the return key. So systemout.println, I'm calling on the println function to print out exactly those characters there. Is it summer? And I'm concatenating onto the end of that string the value from the variable is summer, and I can see there in the previous line that that will print out false. So run that, yes please save it, and the output down the bottom, is it summer, false. So that's just showing you the very basics of declaring a variable, giving it a value and using it again. So to give you another example here, so car, I'm going to call this my initial, I-N-I-T-I-A-L, my initial equals. So the value of a character must be stored in a single quote. So I have S in a single quote and a semicolon. So that's for a character. If I want to store a whole number, so int num. Now this time I'm not assigning it a value. So that sets up int num, declares or says I want to use a variable called num and it's going to hold an int. Now I'm just going to do a print out here. So S out, control space, the value in num is, and I'm doing a plus there for concatenation and the name of the variable. Now I'm just hitting control S to save. So if you have a look there, you can see that that's underlined in red. Now that's the compiler checking down your code and saying something's not right here. So there is a rule. If you declare a variable inside a method, so inside a method, main is my method, and that's determined by these curly brackets here. So anything inside those curly brackets is inside main. And anything you declare inside main or inside a method is known as a local variable. A local variable must be initialized, which means given a value, before it can be accessed or used. So I've attempted to use that variable here to print out the value that's in it, but my variable hasn't been given a value, hasn't been initialized. So when you get that red underline, you can hover over with the mouse and it will say the local variable num may not have been initialized. So now I wouldn't be tempted to go for the quick fixes here because sometimes it would do things to your code that you don't understand. So I've declared the variable num, which is an integer, calling it num. It will hold a whole number. Haven't yet given it a value. It can be given a value on the next line. So num equals 12. That's a statement, semicolon at the end. And now I fixed that compilation error there. Now I'm going to move that just as an example. Cut that out and just pop it on the line underneath. And you will see there that a line of code is still the problem that's there. It can't see the next line. It can only see the previous lines. So I'm just going to move that back up again. So make sure that it's given a value before it's accessed or used or printed. So that should be up there. Now to look at the float and the double, just examples of those. So float, I'm going to put in price of water equals 1.49. And I'm going to put in float price of, we'll go with petrol equals 1.28. Now, oh sorry, the second one I meant to have a double, not a float. I'll just change that. Yeah, so I've declared a float and I've declared a double and I've initialized each one. There's a problem here. The compiler has underlined the float but not underlined the double, the value. So the value on the right hand side of the equals. So that equals is known as an assignment operator and it's read from right to left. So the value on the right will be assigned to the variable on the left. And now, when the compiler sees a literal, so an actual value typed into your program with a decimal point, it sees it as a double. So it sees 1.49 as a decimal point in it. It's a literal. That's a double. What's it being assigned to? A float. Hang on. Double is 8 bytes, so it can store 8 bytes. 8 bytes on the right hand side. The left hand side is a float. It's only half of that. So the problem here is decimal point on the right, that's a double. It's been assigned to a float. It doesn't fit. so it can't be converted. Now, when you type in a literal like that in a float, you need to put an F at the end of it. You can do other casting, but that will be covered in a later tutorial. So now I've said that the literal 1.49 is a float, and now it can be assigned to a float. So that's one of the reasons why it's just easier to use a double. You don't have to put in any what's known as a postfix after the literal. I could if I want to put a D in there, but that is the default. So D for double, F for float. That is the default. You don't have to pop that D in there. Now I just want to show you how to add the two of those together just to perform an operation on them. So I'm going to put in here double result. I can declare that variable on one line. I can assign it a value on the next line, result. So I'm just going to type in PR, I see price of water plus price of petrol, just to add the two of them together. And then to display that, so S out, control space, and the result is, and concatenate on there, oops, sorry, result is, and result. Now I'm going to run my program there. Just to check, is it summer? False. The value of num is 12. The result is 2.77. Now, when you use floating point numbers, they're not 100% precise, and you will often get this kind of overrun. So that is the way that they work. They're not precise. They shouldn't be used for something where you need preciseness or for currency or things like that. You should use the class decimal instead. So again, we'll have to cover that at a later stage. Now, there's one other variable that I want to show you. So that's an example of some of the primitive types, some of the 8 primitive types. And there's one other type that's not in the 8 primitives, but it's called a string, like string name equals Sandra. Now, this is a capital S, whereas the other primitive types, you see that they're lowercase letters. So that has a matching class in what's called the API, or the Application Programming Interface. So it's like a collection or a package of classes that somebody else has written. And we can manipulate strings and call methods on them and trim them in size, or take characters out, or swap them around, or check the length of them. So that's something I'll cover in a later tutorial. One last little thing to note here, if you see the variables underlined in yellow, that's just a warning to say, by the way, you've declared these variables and you haven't used them. So when you're finished writing your program, you might think, oh, I can just delete them. Okay, so that is just an introduction into the 8 primitive types in Java. So again, when you're declaring a variable, you put the data type, followed by the name, so which is known as the identifier that you want to call it, and then optionally you can give the variable a value on the same line, and after it's been declared, then you can use it maybe to print it out or to use it in an operation for adding or multiplying, and that kind of thing.